Hi everyone, this is Graham Weeb, and today we're going to be talking about trails. Three types of trails to be precise. We've got some wispy energy trails that emit light. We've got some smoky trails that would receive light from such as a rocket or a missile. And we've got some weapon swipes here that would come from a trail off of a weapon. And all of these are used off of the same technique that we're just going to be using and remixing in three different ways here. So we're going to jump into that right now. The cool thing about this technique is that it's geometry based, which makes it very art directable. So you can see here that we've got this nice wisp here, and it's following this curve. And in fact, all of our stuff follows curves, and this is very art directable, like so. The disadvantage to this process. So the one thing that you need to watch out for with this method is that I cannot have something walk through this trail without it clipping. So if you want to use this method and you have something walking through this, you might want to reconsider and choose a different method. But if you don't have that, this is a wonderful technique to use. In fact, there's some ways that you can sort of fake it a little bit if absolutely needed, but we won't be going over those today. Today we're just going to be focusing on the geometry effect itself. So we're going to break this down step by step here. So it starts off here with a single plane, and if we take a look at the plane, we can see in its UV coordinates, they perfectly fill the 0 to 1 space. So there's no distortion in the UVs. And this is very useful for us because if we look at our node network, which is actually very simple, we can see that we're using the x-axis of the UVs here to build this gradient. And this is how that fall off is constructed. So we've got a curves here that we're using to rebalance, redistribute these values. A multiply here, which is being used to make that area near the tip glow out. And then we're mixing that in with this texture, which just happens to be a line with some thickness variation. And we've done a color ramp here to sort of beef up that thickness a bit more. And then that goes into an emission add shader with a transparency, making an additive shader. And we've got a nice glowy line. The other thing that we're going to want to do in preparation for the curve is we're going to want to go into weight paint mode, and I'll go here, and we're going to use the gradient tool to create a weight painted group from tip to tail on this geometry. And this is where you want 100% on the tail and 0% on the tip. And that can be found in the vertex groups here. Once you've got that, we can start placing it on our curve. I'll go over to here. So I've made a starburst pattern, so you can see that what I've done is I've duplicated our plane and I've just rotated it 45 degrees each time until I've gotten this starburst. And this allows me to sort of view it from all directions at once. If, however, you are playing to a specific camera and you want it to look a very specific way, instead of doing the starburst, you can in fact do the plane, but you will change the curl of the curve itself. So I could go to this point, for example, and I can adjust the tilt, and you can see how it actually turns and rotates the object that's following that curve there. So you can create a curve that has the geometry always looking at the camera without having that edge towards the camera if you're worried about something like that and you don't want the starburst effect. Other than that, if we go here, we can see that there's two modifiers on this. We've got a curve modifier and a displacement modifier. The curve is simply the trajectory that we want our trail to travel, and we use animation along the x-axis, just like this. And when we do that and we attach a curve modifier selecting our curve, we're able to travel along that. So this is super artist friendly, allows you to get just the right timings that you want. Now, in order to get, and this could be what you're going for. If you want something that's just like a straight trail like this works well. If you want something, however, that's got a little bit more of that wispy end to it, we've got our displacement. And there's a few things to note about the displacement. The first one is that the displacement is in global coordinates. So that means that the noise itself, the texture that we're moving through, is sitting in global space and our geometry moves through it. And this allows it to give the impression that the trail sort of distorts based off of some sort of turbulence in the air. If we were to set this to something like UV, you can see how it moves exactly with the trail. So this doesn't flap around at all, so that's not what you would expect. And if we were to set this to local, you can see that it's doing something, but once again, it's still not exactly what you would expect. So global is the one that you want for this. It will give you your best results. The second thing to note is we've used our vertex group here to allow it so that at the tip we have 0% distortion and at the tail we have 100% distortion. So that gives us that nice wispy look as it comes off of the front there. If I were to disengage this entirely, you can see this is what we get, which could be something very cool if that's what you're after. But if you want something that looks like a traveling wispy bit of energy, you're going to want that that group that adjusts the displacement based on the tip to tail. The last thing is we've got an RGB to XYZ, and that's to accompany our RGB, our color clouds. So this is what's giving our form to the shape here. So we've got a Blender original clouds that we're using, and that's creating this sort of shape to the trail. If you wanted to do something else, you can choose a whole bunch of different clouds, or you could choose a whole bunch of different options there and run your own solution, but all of these will wind up making this look different. We can also adjust our size of the noise as well, and this will allow us to dial in our look. And we're also able to, over in the modifier, adjust the strength as well, and that will also once again help define the exact look as well. So those are the two things that you can dial in to get your displacement shaping the way that you want. And that's pretty much it for the energy. We're going to move on now to the smoke. And we can see here that there's a lot of things similar, but there's a few things that are different. So we can also have displacement on this one as well. So similar deal here. You can see that I'm not displacing quite as much though. But I'm actually going to turn it off for this this case here. So there's a few things. We're using the same star pattern as before. And if we look at our material, it's a little bit more complex. Up here at the front, we've exchanged our additive shader out for a diffuse shader that's being mixed with transparency. So everything that we do here is generating an alpha, and we're using that to mix between the diffuse, which is our smoke color, and transparency. We've got a Fresnel here, which we are using specifically for making the edge of this effect softer so that it's less visible that we're dealing with a star-shaped pattern. You can see it from some angles, but we're trying to basically trick it a little bit so that you're not seeing a whole lot of that star pattern all the time with this. It's a lot easier to hide in the energy one, although you can still see it a little bit. This is one of the reasons why you might want to go for that previous method that I suggested where you play specifically to the camera and you tilt the curve to match the plane instead of building the star pattern. Over here, we've got our tip to tail fade off, as we had with our energy. And we've also got a side-to-side fall off that we're mixing with this noise here. And this is where the magic happens, is right here. This is the main difference between the energy and the smoke here. So in order for our effect to feel like smoke, we want our smoke to linger in the air. And so we don't want it to necessarily follow one-to-one with the traveling of the curve, and that's what this is for. You might recognize this section here as something from one of our previous tutorials with our stylized fire. And you can see here that we're scrolling the UVs based on a value. And what that value is the amount that this has moved in the x-axis. Because we're animating along the x-axis to get it to move along the curve, we're able to hijack that value and use it to multiply against our UVs. And this is super useful because this value right here determines how much it stays in place versus how much it travels with our curve. So if I were to say set this to 0, you can see how this pretty much moves with the trail as it moves forward. And this doesn't feel right. And if I had 0.1 here, it now feels like it's actually moving backwards. So it's moving in the correct direction, but it's not staying in place, and it still feels a little weird. And so I noticed in this particular case, a value of 0.06 was pretty reasonable because it gives a little bit of a drag. It pulls it a little bit forward with it. But other than that, it keeps it pretty much in place. And this is a value that you're going to have to adjust based on your situation, but it gives you that control that you're wanting for dialing in your effect. We add all of that together and we're able to get something that pretty much hangs in the air the way that we want. And that all gets thrown in as an alpha. And that's how we get our smoke here. Our last one that we're going to look at is this sword swipe, like so. And this one we've handled a little bit differently. So the first thing is this geometry doesn't actually move anymore. I built this out of a curve, so I had a curve that I established based on the arc of the weapon, and I extruded that curve out into this geometry here. And that's where the shader comes in. Now, I should also mention that you could do this the exact same way that we've handled the smoke and the red line, but I just wanted to show another way of doing trails with the geometry static and in place and not animating. So in this case, we've got something that's a little more complicated, but you'll notice a lot of similar themes to what we had in that stylized fire from the previous tutorial if you haven't checked that out. We've got a centralized value here, and this is where we're actually doing our animation of the swipe. So instead of this geometry being animated, we're animating this value, and this is what's controlling that swipe. So we've got 3 textures here. I'm just going to briefly go through these. And these all scroll at different values. So we're using that scrolling technique. And we're using remaps and multiplies and all that sort of stuff in order to get these 3 different textures to all scroll in different directions at different speeds just to create a little bit of interest in this trail. We mix all of those together and we get something like this. And down here, we've just got a mask that we're using to mask off the ends and a little bit of the sides here. And so we mix that all together and we have something that ends and starts pretty reasonably. This gets pumped into a shader that allows us to adjust our colors and our values. So that gives us this right here. So we've got some nice color variation, we've got some nice brightness variation, and this goes into, just like in our red line, we've got a additive shader here at the end for this swipe. And that's pretty much it. 3 swipes with 3 different methods here. We've got our energy wisps, we've got our sword swipe, and we've got our smoke. Hopefully this has been informative. I look forward to seeing all the swipes and trails that you guys come up with, and we'll see you all in the next one.